In this video, I'll show you how to color royal icing and explain why, especially at the beginning, there's no need to buy a large collection of pre-mixed colors. If you're just starting out, a small set of basic food colorings is enough to create most of the colors you'll use in your work. To begin with, 6 basic colors are enough: red, black, yellow, blue, green, and brown. Later, you can add lemon yellow, a cool red, and a warm blue, such as royal blue for more precise color mixing. Royal icing is colored while it's still thick. Once the desired shade is reached, it's thinned with water to the consistency you need. Orange is made by mixing yellow and red. Yellow is the base color with just a small amount of red added. For 1 heaping tablespoon of icing, I added 1 drop of yellow food coloring and just a tiny amount of red, using the tip of a wooden coffee stir stick. I added a bit too much red and the color shifted toward coral. That's not a problem. If the shade isn't quite right, it can always be adjusted. By adding more yellow, I bring the color back toward orange. To do that, I added 2 more drops of yellow food coloring. In the end, I ended up with 2 shades of orange, a brighter one with more red added, and a softer, more pastel version that I mixed separately off camera by adding the red very gradually. To make green, I first color the icing yellow, adding 1 fairly generous drop of yellow coloring. Then I gradually add blue, just a tiny amount on the tip of a skewer, mixing well each time to carefully control the shade and avoid overdoing it. The result is a nice fresh green shade. Now let's move on to purple. The principle is the same. I start with a base color and then gradually add the second one to control the shade. First, I mix a medium intensity blue, not too dark and not pastel. In my case, it took about 2 drops of blue coloring for 1 heaping tablespoon of icing. Then I add red little by little, just on the tip of a skewer, mixing well each time until I'm happy with the color. It's important not to overdo it. Too much red can make the color look muddy. Next, I mix a beige color. There are many shades of beige, so here I'm showing a versatile option that I use most often in my decorating. I add a very small amount of brown coloring. The shade should stay light and pastel. Then I add a little yellow and mix the icing well. I add both colors using a skewer, not full drops with slightly more brown than yellow. The result is a soft, neutral beige. Pink can be made by adding a small amount of red coloring to white base icing. The less red you use, the softer and more pastel the shade will be. If you add a little bit of pink to the beige we mixed using brown and yellow, the shade becomes warmer. This is a color I often use for character skin tones. Unfortunately, the camera doesn't capture this nuance very accurately. The difference is much more noticeable in real life. A fresh green shade is easy to mix using yellow and blue. For deeper forest greens, it's better to use a ready-made forest green coloring. In total, we've added 5 more shades to the 6 basic colors I showed at the beginning. This set is more than enough to get started and to create most basic designs, especially for beginners. I didn't mix colors like red and black on camera because the process is very straightforward. You simply add the coloring directly from the jar until you reach the intensity you're happy with. It's important to understand that bold, saturated colors like red and black always require a larger amount of coloring. Deep, intense shades don't come from just a couple of drops, and that's completely normal. Gray, on the other hand, is made using a very small amount of black, just the tip of a skewer. The intensity of gray is easy to control by adjusting how much black you add. Now we move on to the next stage, practice. To start, we place the printed images into a clear plastic sheet protector. For this practice, I'll be using 4 icing colors. Each color is prepared in 2 consistencies, piping and medium. This helps with skill building and practice. I'll also be using a scribe tool to smooth the icing and fix small imperfections when needed. It's best to start outlining at areas where the shape has corners or indentations. A star is perfect for this because it has plenty of those points. I begin by touching the surface with the tip of the piping bag, applying pressure, and slightly lifting the bag as I pipe. I don't lift it too high. The star points are short, so it's important to bring the tip back down in time, placing a small dot right where the line should end to keep everything clean and precise. The outline always needs a few minutes to set before flooding. If you start filling right away while it's still soft, the pressure from the icing can easily move it out of place. While the outline hasn't fully set yet, you can gently adjust the seam using a scribe tool to smooth the line. About 2 minutes have passed, the outline has set, and I can move on to filling the center without worrying that the outline might shift during flooding. When working with a thicker icing consistency, I keep the tip of the piping bag moving continuously, working in one direction and leveling the icing as I go. By the end of flooding, the surface is already smooth, and a scribe is rarely needed, just to slightly adjust the corners and refine the shape. When we work using the outline technique, the border between the outline and the flood remains clearly visible because we allow the outline to dry first. So when I fill in the center, I don't cover the outline or go over it from the top. I carefully bring the flood icing right up to the outline, keeping it clean and well defined. Icing piped onto a plastic sheet always dries more slowly than icing on a cookie, simply because the moisture has nowhere to absorb. Even a small piece can take a long time to dry. Sometimes a full 24 hours isn't enough. From the back, the icing may still feel slightly damp or sticky even after a day. Drying time depends on the conditions. At room temperature, especially with higher humidity, the process slows down, while forced drying helps speed it up. That's why in my work I always use forced drying. After the center of the star is filled, the piece goes into the oven for a short time so the icing can start to set, and then it finishes drying at room temperature. If you'd like to learn more about drying royal icing, I cover this topic in detail in a separate article on my website. You can find the link to the article in the description below this video. The flooded surface is smooth and even and doesn't require additional leveling with a scribe. I only use the scribe to lightly refine the sharp corners so the shape looks cleaner. Next, I move on to the next shape, a mushroom. This shape is slightly more complex than the previous one as it consists of two elements, the cap and the stem. I outline the cap first and then the stem, following the same principles we discussed earlier. To outline the stem, I bring the piping tip up to the side of the cap and start the line from there. I finish the outline the same way, bringing the line back to the side of the cap. This keeps the stem outline from overlapping the cap and results in a clean, neat connection with no overlap. I start flooding the stem only after the outline has had time to set. After flooding the stem, I'll place the sheet in the oven for a short time so the top layer of icing can set and form a light crust. This makes it easier to move on to the next step. If preferred, the icing can also be left to dry at room temperature. It will just take longer. The sheet with the figures spent a few minutes in the oven, allowing the icing on the stem to lightly set on the surface. Now I move on to flooding the cap. If the cap were flooded while the icing on the stem was still wet, the icing would blend where the two parts meet and the edge wouldn't stay clean. This short pause between stages helps keep a clear, well-defined separation between the cap and the stem. At the point where the cap meets the stem, I simply bring the icing up to the edge of the stem without piping over it. The icing connects naturally, without added pressure. Because the stem has already had time to set, a clean visual separation remains between the two elements. I use a scribe to lightly refine the corners and then place the sheet in the oven for a few minutes. The next and final shape in this video is an umbrella. Out of the three, it requires a bit more focus, as it includes more curved lines that call for a steadier hand. If the lines don't turn out perfectly on the first try, that's completely normal. The icing can be gently removed with a paper towel or a scribe tool, and you can simply start again. I start filling the center once the outline has had a little time to set. At this point, you can see that I haven't brought the icing all the way into the narrow corner. There's a small gap left. In spots like this, working with the tip of the piping bag isn't very convenient, and it's easy to overdo it and lose a clean edge. So I leave this area for now and come back to it later, gently pulling the icing into place with a scribe. The umbrella canopy has 3 segments, and I start by filling the side segments that don't touch each other. After that, I place the piece in the oven so the icing can dry slightly. As I mentioned earlier, this technique helps keep the edges between the segments clean and prevents them from blending together. After a short drying time, I move on to filling the center segment. At this stage, the side segments are only partially set. A thin crust has formed on the surface, while the icing underneath is still soft. That's why it's important to work gently along the edges and avoid applying too much pressure, as excess pressure can damage the neighboring sections and cause cracking. After filling the central segment, I place the piece back in the oven briefly so the icing can start to set. Then it finishes drying at room temperature along with the rest of the pieces. Working step by step helps maintain the shape, clean edges, and a neat finish, even with more complex designs. This video covers 3 basic shapes and the key stages of working with royal icing. PDF templates for practice are available. The link to the article with free materials can be found below the video.